So our panelist is talking about the challenge in communicating in this area. Let me précis the challenge. The challenge first is communicating that identifying problems is a first step in the self-corrective process, that when it moves to fruition, offers and implements solutions and tests them to make sure that they have in fact addressed the problem. Changing the frame to increase the likelihood that those in the scientific community, when they talk about their identification of problems, make that point clear is, I think, a message for scientists. Talking with reporters to make the same point so that the headlines do not feature the problems without the self-corrective identification involved in isolating them. And also, when they are citing those scholars who've identified the problems, indicate what solutions are on the table that these same scientists are offering could be a journalistic effort to increase the likelihood that this challenge is accurately responded to in news coverage structures. We have a final challenge in communicating, and that is finding the language that best communicates what it is we are trying to do. And Marcia is addressing that by saying perhaps we need to change the language through which we think about retraction, because it may be creating a disincentive for honest error correction, and that would be undesirable. At the same time, the move to try to change the language of conflict of interest so that it doesn't imply, as it does automatically in the political domain, that any conflict of interest means that you are corrupt, but rather suggests that you are disclosing relationships that one needs to evaluate as one looks at the scientific process and the findings that resulted from that funding. Could be a language correction that would be a response to the challenge that we are facing. With that as a summary, let me tell you why we organized the panel this way. If we say that the problem right now in the news coverage is that Kevin's part of the presentation is being overrepresented, and Marcia's part of the presentation is being underrepresented, and Kevin's part of the presentation is not being framed as part of the self-corrective enterprise, and Marcia's not as the next step in that self-correction, then we run the risk that in the domain of expertise where we have our trustworthiness, Susan, we are going to have partisans engaged in polarizing science using the fact of an overrepresented problem in the absence of its self-corrective nature and its solutions to indict the science at issue in controversial scientific engagements. With that, let me open to questions, comments, and we welcome folks coming in on Twitter.
I love the second one there.
I'm going to let Marcia take the second question, read it and answer it.
Yeah. So from David Adamson at Rand Corporation via the webcast, he asks, do you think that portrayals of scientists in popular culture, such as the Big Bang Theory, have influenced public perception of scientists, and positively or negatively? So, David, I can't imagine but that what you say is not true. And here at the National Academy of Sciences, we do have something called the Science Entertainment Exchange, in which we pair scientists with Hollywood screenwriters and producers. And the purpose is to try to portray a richer and more variety of scientific characters that actually reflect the full range of personalities and real people, so that they understand we're not all nerds and we're not all socially inept. And, you know, some of us have real lives, and we love our children and things like that. So thank you for that question. Unfortunately, there are just a few shows, and the narrative of the scientist as the mad person who's off to destroy the world has taken hold in far too many flicks, and we're trying to change that, but it's one character at a time.
Thank you. And the first question on the screen is for Susan. I'll let you read it and answer it.
From Navina, by way of Twitter, did we lose the fundamental ability to trust each other in the era of fake news and outright fraud in so many areas of our lives? I mean, in the American context, people's baseline default expectation about other people is sort of, it's promiscuously trusting. Americans really tend to trust other people. That is, they trust other Americans. So I won't go beyond that. But but empirically, when they do cross-cultural comparisons of levels of trust, Americans are sort of deliriously high on this. And I find that kind of endearing about us. And so, I think that this is not a recent phenomenon to call things into question, but to the extent that the polarized political climate, people have an investment on either side of making the other side look bad, that's obviously a destructive situation.
Thank you. Question from the floor.
The words, I think, matter a lot.
And you are, tell the people in the Twitterverse who you are.
I'm Alan Lishner.
Thank you.
I'm unemployed.
Those of you looking for a distinguished individual have employment opportunities.
No, Alan works for me, unpaid, full-time.
I've noticed that. The words matter a lot. And I think when people talk within the scientific community about science being a self-correcting process, that usually is used to refer to the fact that science finds its own mistakes in subsequent research, not that science is keeping its house in order. And I think those actually are two different issues. One, it's true. Boo-boos typically get caught. Somebody has an experiment that's wrong, somebody later will fix it, discover the real thing. But the fact that scientists are keeping our own house in order and trying to do a better and better job of monitoring the quality of our own work is different, and I think a much more valuable message to be putting out. And I think using the term science is self-correcting could be misleading.
I don't take that as a question. I take that as a comment. Is it misleading? I don't think it is, because the public has no sense of what scientists mean when they talk to each other about it, nor are they familiar with Robert Merton. So I think to the extent that we are now talking in public space for the first time, we have the right to claim the words that in ordinary language make sense. That is, science as an enterprise is engaging in a self-evaluation, having identified problems, and is trying to correct them. And I'd hate to give that up on the grounds that there's a technical, narrow meaning institutionalized in arcane literature by individuals in the past. Next audience question. Please identify yourself.
Margaret Karembu from Kenya.
Welcome.
Thank you. Now, my question is about use of pictures, pictorials, and illustrations in scientific articles. And there is this one persistent picture, and you always say that one picture speaks more than 1,000 words, where genetic engineering is depicted as injecting genes to crops, plants, anything. And of course, this has had serious implications on the trust for scientists by policymakers, farmers, and indeed the general public. My question to Marcia, just as you had a unified response to the article on trouble in the lab because of the serious implications on perceptions of science and scientists, have you found a need to have a unified response to use of pictorials that depict or demonize certain disciplines in science? Secondly, for the media, in Africa, we've tried as much as possible to talk to editors of science pages and newsletters about the use of this one picture of needles being injected on maize, tomatoes, anything. But the response we get is that that picture attracts readership, and so it doesn't matter whether the story is accurate or inaccurate, but because they want to attract readers to scientific stories, that's a story or that's a picture that ensures everyone interested in food production reads that article. Yeah. How do you resolve that kind of conflict? And so they actually advised that they can never withdraw that picture. We've given them so many other better pictures.
Thank you.
But they haven't. Thank you.
That's an important question, Marcia.
Okay, well, let me just talk quickly about the first one. Certainly, the National Academy does weigh in on controversial areas. A good example is the report we put out not too long ago on genetically modified organisms, because we understood that, of course, there's a lot of concern on both sides about GMO crops. Are they a good thing? What are their benefits? What are their risks? And this was a report that the Academy actually bent over backwards to deal with the concern about conflicts of interest. And one way that the committee really worked hard on it was they took the full body of literature and they screened it for reports that had been funded by industry that funds GMO research, that actually puts GMO crops out, and identified which ones might be biased because they're funded by GMO industry, and then looked at, on the other hand, science that was funded by anti-GMO organizations, and separated out those two groups and looked at what science was left that might be considered impartial and unbiased. And for that reason, the report came to some different conclusions than other studies beforehand. So the Academy does weigh in and is very careful when they do.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to combine two questions to Susan. The first comes from Steve via webcast feed. And it is there something inherently incongruous between warm and trustworthy and dispassionate, objective and evidence-based? Parens, he says, hallmarks of the scientific method. And then, related question from Kelly, also via webcast. Do you think that as scientists come out of the lab to communicate with the public, their warmth and trustworthiness will increase? Is this partially because most of the public doesn't know a scientist personally? And let me give you both of these, since I just combined two questions, making it very difficult for you to answer.
Oh, they're
okay,
right
you go off the screen. Okay.
So the warmth dimension has in it morality and sociability. And so I think it's important to realize you can be perfectly moral and also, competent and dispassionate. So there's not an inherent contradiction between these two things. That being said, when you look at a whole society, in many countries, groups are spread out across the space the way you saw in the picture that I put up. If you're talking about two groups, there is a tendency to say one is warm and the other one is competent. This sometimes happens to people's children if you have two. This is my smart one, this is my nice one. Don't go there as a parent, I suggest. But that's a unique comparative context when you have just two people or groups you're comparing. So the other question was whether when scientists come out of the lab to communicate, does their warmth and trustworthiness increase? I mean, I do think that it's helpful to meet an individual person from a group that you don't know. This is an old prescription from the intergroup relations literature. If you don't know anybody from the group, it's easier to caricature them. So yes, this is also urging us to come out of the lab and communicate with the public as individuals. And I haven't tested this, but it seems to me that if you explain what you're why you became a scientist, that, you know, curious was really salient, that it supplies the motivation that otherwise a vacuum exists, right? And I don't think that it runs the danger of arguing by anecdote. So it's just a thought.
Thank you. We have time for one last very brief question because we're running out of time.
Okay. Just a quick observation before my question, and again, this is Emmanuel Taylor from Energetics Incorporated. Quick observation, just because the topic of images came up, the Trouble in the Lab article had that image associated with it, and on one hand, I was just glad to see so many underrepresented people shown in that particular image being associated with science. On the other hand, it'd be great to see that many women and minorities, black and brown people associated with images of science being successful. But that's an aside.
Yes. Very good.
Now, my question is about the culture of science and failures, right? And so I really am struggling with this question of whether or not the news is just inaccurately characterizing the scientific community. We say that failure is just a part of the scientific process. We embrace it, it's iterative, and the news is mischaracterizing this process by not recognizing that. But when I look at the scientific community, we reward and we publish the successes, and we don't publish the failures. And this is very counterproductive, especially at looking at innovation pathways, right? In the past, something might not have worked,
Okay,
but now we have new information.
Soon.
I'm sorry?
Go to a question soon.
Okay, so yeah, I am, don't worry. So something might not have worked in the past, but now we have new information and methods. It's almost impossible at times to trace back why things failed in the past because that typically doesn't get published. So my question is there a failure in the media of recognizing this iterative process that accepts failure? Or is there an actual problem in the science culture where we don't accept failure?
Okay, I think I can do it. So this is changing in science. For example, the Center for Open Science had the pre-registration challenge, where if you pre-register your study with a journal, they guarantee that they will publish the result regardless of how it ends up, positive or negative. And so they are trying to get over the file drawer effect where negative results don't get published.
And since we have 41 seconds left and Kevin has not had a question, I'm going to ask him this provocative original question. Kevin, if there's one article that one should read in Issues of Science and Technology this week, what is it?
So, well, I would say we had an article recently, a debate about the science police, and it was the tendency of some people in the science community not to have an open enough debate. So largely this is revolving around work that Roger Pilkey has done, for example, on to the extent to which any given storm or bad weather is a result of climate change, which is an area where the research is much squishier than it is about whether or not overall the climate is warming in response to carbon dioxide. So I think that we have to worry about being too defensive and not trusting the public and having some of these internal debates. And the fear of some scientists was that if you talked, for instance, about a hiatus in climate change, that was undermining faith in the scientific community. And I would say that instead we should be looking at all times for openness in the scientific community, in all our debates, and trust the public more than we do.
Trust in scientists, trust in public. Thank you, everyone.